Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be, what you signed up to hear about was a really groundbreaking study that really pioneered by Graham and Wallace and the folks from ANSI, and obviously the whole team behind the National Commission for the Certification of Crane Operators, and then a lot of folks around ITI, as well as Cirrus Labs up in Edmonton, Alberta. So we'll get into all of that, but basically the study was published during the ConExpo week, and it's titled Virtual Reality's Role in Crane Operator Certification Testing.
As you rightly said, Zach, this is a product of the NCCCO Foundation, although the study itself has its genesis in NCCCO. So everything I'm going to be talking about today is from the Foundation's perspective. The Foundation is a completely separate entity from NCCCO, and so I am not speaking today for NCCCO at all. Everything I say is from the perspective of the Foundation. We did actually do a smaller study prior to this one, which enabled us to sort of road test the concept. And then we decided to expand it, design it, remove some of the wrinkles that had occurred during the first one, and enrolled both ITI, and we knew we needed an expert in practical exam design, development, and implementation. As I've said before, and I'll say again, that was the easiest part of this process, almost as easy as Roy Swift saying, please do a test, a study, because the first person that came to mind, and really the only person that came to mind, was the gentleman that's going to follow me now, and that's Dr. Wallace Judd. You just need to read the first 3 bullet points to get a sense of his educational background. And we have to do it for Wallace because his humility is also an attribute of his. And so he'd be the last person to tell you. But with a Ph.D. from Stanford in psychometrics, you could probably stop right there. This is the gentleman who I've worked with now for over a dozen years. He was an ANSI assessor. That's to say he's one of the team that comes in to determine whether or not a certification program is of sufficient quality to become accredited. And he was actually so impressed with our practical exam program that he quit his job as an ANSI assessor and came to work with us with NCCCO as a consultant. He's developed tests for clients ranging from CrossFit to Microsoft. He did a spell at Apple. He's worked for Oracle, Linux, you name it. He's actually the author of more than 30 publications and books. And really, there is nobody else that could have conducted this study in the way that he has. So with that said, it gives me very great pleasure to turn this presentation over to Dr. Wallace Judd.
Thanks, Graham. I really appreciate it. I want to make sure that my screen is being shared.
Yep.
This study, I'll just give you a little background, was to see whether or not the virtual reality experience could predict how well people would perform on the actual crane. So that was our goal. Now, here are candidates that we used to evaluate this. Notice that most of the candidates, 60% were in the 25 to 44-year-old range, which was quite typical for crane operators. And the people had a lot of experience. They ranged from a few that had 0 years, that data was questionable, all the way through people who had 20 years. There were a number of those, and then some with more than 20 years. Crane experience, this is this is how many hours of experience they've had on crane. And you can see that the people who are highly experienced had more than an aggregate of 30,000 hours. The cranes that we used for the study, the actual cranes are here at Tadano, a link belt and a Broderson trainer. The crane controls were modeled after the crane that they were to simulate. So here's a Tadano simulator. You can see where the controls are. Here's a headset over on the left. And there was a way to monitor what they were seeing on the desktop. The actual controls in the physical crane obviously look substantially different. The virtual controls were meant to model the controls in the crane. So if there were 3 on one side, then there'd be 3 on the other side. In this set, this is obviously 2 and 2. This is the perspective from inside the crane in the virtual simulation. You can just barely see the person down there giving signals, and you can see part of the course on the left-hand side. That's the zigzag corridor that they're going to have to take a virtual load through. Here is the perspective of the entire crane. Here's the zigzag corridor right here between the stanchions. There is a person who is monitoring the performance. The candidate is driving the crane. He's got this 5-ton weight that he has to carry through the zigzag corridor in both directions. Once he gets done with one way, has to go back through in the other way. Now, the items that are evaluated are in the list on the left. There's initial walk around the ball. That's the headache ball, not the weight, but the headache ball goes in a barrel, actually 2 barrels. The ball has to go into a stop circle. Then they are tested on hand signals. This is the zigzag corridor forward, zigzag corridor backward, and then shutdown procedure. All of those things were tested in the virtual crane as well as with the actual crane. Now, our previous study was done at a number of different locations with all the candidates, and asked people to take the virtual reality twice and take the actual crane twice. Now notice that when they took the test with the actual crane, the correlation between their first and second score was 0.88, which is not nearly as high as you'd expect. You'd say, why isn't it 1.0? Well, it wasn't 1.0 because they're people, not machines. People taking the VR test had less correlation. So this is the correlation of the VR test 1 with VR test 2, 0.69, not that high. There were issues with the previous study that we were able to iron out. First, there were a lot of different cranes, and not only that, but there were certain circumstances in which the controls didn't mirror the crane, the actual physical crane. There were a number of locations, and there was variability, for example, in the amount of practice that people took. There were people whose credentials were not evaluated strongly, and the instruction changed dramatically from location to location. So these are issues that we ironed out in the second study. I'm going to skip this because I'll clarify that initial classification accuracy. The classification accuracy in this case, this is just an illustration, is the people who passed, who were classified correctly. Sorry. So that is 10 and 20. That's 30 people out of a total of 40 people. So the classification accuracy in this illustration would be 75%. Now, in the previous study, the initial classification accuracy was 35%. And we really wanted to see if there was something that we could do to improve that in the next study by improving the conditions and also using artificial intelligence to link the VR study results with the actual crane. So when we did the second study, we did it with 53 candidates, and you can see the classification accuracy here was 0.77. And the thing that's a little bit discouraging is if you pass the VR test, then a number of the people passed the crane test, but there were 8 people who passed the VR test and failed the crane test. that was a real problem. So we changed the cut score. And now we got it so that 19 passed the crane test if they passed the VR test, and only 5 failed. But we weren't satisfied with that. Basically, the decision consistency was 0.79, and the classification accuracy was 0.83. Well, what we were able to do is use artificial intelligence to change the weights of the domains being evaluated on the VR test and use them with different weightings to predict success and failure on the crane test. Once we used that artificial intelligence, you notice that we had 17 people pass the VR test and also pass the crane test. And with this group, only 2 people failed the crane test who passed the VR test. And we looked in detail at that and said, what's going on here? How come we have even 2 people? It turned out one of the people was a person who had never been in a crane before. He only had experience, and a lot of experience with virtual reality. So he was a gamer. And because of the fact that he didn't meet our initial conditions, we went ahead and excluded him. And our final results were 1 person failed and 17 passed on the crane if they passed the VR. Now, we weren't too worried about these people down here. It was too bad some of them failed and that sort of stuff. But here, what we were really concerned with was the decision consistency. If they passed the VR test, did they pass the crane test? And that the answer to that was with 94% accuracy, the answer was yes. If you passed the VR test, you were gonna pass the crane test. So decision consistency, this is some math for all of you who are interested in type 1 errors and the statistics, but the real critical issue is we now have decision consistency of 94% in those numbers, and that's very powerful. It means you've got a great predictor for the VR test of how people will perform on the crane test. Now, we did have a couple recommendations as a result of this, and we hope we'll be able to do follow-on studies. We want to make sure everybody gets 45 minutes practice on VR machine before they take the VR test. Some people went into the test with not in the earlier study with not enough experience. We'd like to verify adequate crane experience. Obviously, that wasn't the case with the 1 person who had 0 crane experience. We wanted to say that there should be conditions. If the candidate fails the VR, maybe they could be offered a discounted crane test. And we wanted to make sure that data was collected on the VR tests and follow up and see how they did on the crane test. Our final recommendation was this: if they had a high score on VR, then we might predict that they can certify on the actual crane. Whether or not they have to physically verify that or not is up to the certifying agency. But after the first cut point, if people did well, but not well enough to certify, then we would recommend that we allow them to test on an actual crane and see if they can, strut their stuff. If they were below the second cut point, then we recommend additional practice without any further information.